welcome. Well, today our programme's all about vegetables, but there's a sort of a problem with vegetables, and that is that the British have a very poor reputation for cooking vegetables. And the reason is very often because they put far too much water in them, and they cook them for far too long. I think vegetables have been underestimated, probably because we've always had lashings of beautiful meat here, and they've just been something to help the meat go down. But vegetables now are coming into their own because meat is becoming very expensive. And so I want to try and, if I can, steer you away from waterlogging and into new ways of cooking vegetables. But first of all, with the use of some animated film, I want to show you what happens when you put too much water with vegetables. Water and overcooking are the true enemies of vegetables because all the useful vitamins and minerals and flavours they contain will seep out of the vegetables into the water if you're not very careful. You can see here on these two pots, the pot on the left has too much water, and as it boils, all the flavour and goodness is passing into the water and leaving behind very pale, tasteless vegetables. Now, the pot on the right has much less water, but even here, of course, if you go on cooking them too long, they'll also go pale and lose some of their food value. But anyway, before we start our war on water, a few weeks ago I went to visit an expert, Bill Sauerbatz, up in Ashton-under-Lyne, to find out a few tips about growing and choosing vegetables.
It's pretty heavy, but it's been worked very well. This, for instance, this block belongs to a fellow called Mr. Hulley, who incidentally has just gone to California to see his parents.
Oh, well, that's a big occasion.
And he had a great decision to make whether to stay with his allotment to go and see his son and daughter-in-law. But he's grown some very, very good stuff. These carrots, for instance, are very nice, and it's time they were lifted, I'm sure. Now, there we are.
My goodness.
Now, I figure that's a beautiful carrot.
Yes.
There's no maggot there. It's as fresh as paint. It's big enough. If you left that in and it went, half as big again, it would be coarse and it would lose condition.
Yes.
That, I would say, is an ideal carrot for storing.
And what's the best way to store carrots, Bill?
Well, the important thing, so they don't lose condition and lose moisture, they want to be in sand, dry sand, in a cool, dark position. Never in a warm garage or anything like that, or under the stairs or any nonsense like that. They must be cool and dark, just like potatoes must be, so they don't shrivel. If they shrivel, they're losing condition all the time.
Do you agree, Bill, that the test of a really good cook is if you can make a potato really taste like a potato?
I think it would take an exceptionally good cook to make some potatoes taste like potatoes, because a lot of varieties, a lot of modern varieties, alas, taste like soap. No matter what you do with them, it still does taste like soap, parabolic soap.
Can you recommend a couple of varieties, Bill, that are good for flavour and good for cooking, that can be grown anywhere?
Yeah, I've got one variety that I've grown this year. It's an early, that's Ulster Sceptre.
Ulster Sceptre?
It's good flavour, and well, look how it bulks up. Beautiful spud down. It's Ulster Sceptre.
Yes.
It's nice, very, very young for salad use, and it's nice later on for chipping, and it'll boil well too. That's Ulster Sceptre.
What about a later variety?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I've got another one here, Pentland Dell. Pentland Dell. Now, that's a late variety. Now, that's a real quality potato. It's not a particularly big sample, but you don't want them too big or they get a bit coarse. Now, that's Pentland Dell.
And do you agree?
A late variety will grow anywhere in the country.
Do you agree with eating the skins as well, like I do?
I know a lot of Scotch people do this, don't they?
Yes.
I think you know, that's part of the economy of the Scotch, really. No, I don't like the skins, but each to his choice, isn't it?
I'd like to go and have a look at the celery now, Bill.
Okay, well, there's some good celery up here.
I always think it's amazing how Mother Nature, you know, when the salads die off, she provides us with lovely crunchy celery.
Well, celery is always in its best condition, this type of celery, after frost, because the carbohydrates are changing into sugars and it's sweeter.
I'm pleased to hear you mention frost, Bill, because I never buy my celery until well into November after there's been a good frost.
Well, that's the time when this type of celery, which is blanched celery, has its best flavour. This is blanched by the exclusion of light. It's just got a touch of maggot there, which shows that blister, but it's not serious. It'll be a good crop, that, about November, December, when it's had a touch of frost, and that sweetens it up. That's when it's beautiful with a cheese, you know.
Moving on to the onions over here, they seem rather large for the kitchen. Actually, no, there are one or two smaller ones here, but it's true, isn't it, that the smaller the onion, the stronger the flavour?
Yes. Now, here's a good crop of onions, but some of them are thick-necked. Delia, for instance, that's an example of a thick-necked onion. You see, That one's using immediately because it will not keep. It's no chance of keeping that at all. It's a thick neck one. Now on the other hand, there you have a nice ripe onion, smaller, but that will dry off. It's no neck.
Oh no, that's got no neck at all.
No, well, it's dried off. It's approaching proper ripeness. That thick one, neck one never will do. So you eat this last and eat the thick one, neck one first.
Oh, well, I've learned something from that.
Great.
I know it's a silly question to ask you, but have you got any favourite vegetables? I mean, eating flavour-wise, to eat.
Favourite vegetable would be a very good potato, roasted round some good fat beef in the tin.
Yes.
In an old-fashioned oven.
Well, we just happen to have here some lovely, crisp, crunchy roast potatoes. I hope you're watching, Bill. They've been done in beef dripping, unfortunately not round the joint, but I think the operative word with roast potatoes is real crunchiness. They've got to be nice and crunchy and crisp. And then if you open one, I think in the centre, they need to look really sort of soft and floury, like that. Well, anyway, how to achieve that, how to get really crisp, crunchy roast potatoes, I'm now going to show you. First of all, you need to select your potatoes, peel them as thinly as possible, and then you put them in a saucepan, cover them with boiling water with some salt, and you parboil them. Parboil them, that's for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then you drain off the water and keep the water because you might need it for the gravy or something like that. And then you keep the lid on the potatoes. I'll just show you these parboiled potatoes that I've got in here now. Then you put the lid on and you give them a really good shaking about. Now I'll take the lid off and try and do that without the lid so you can see what's happening, which is in fact roughing up the edges of the potatoes to get good rough edges, and that's how you get that lovely crunchy crispness. And I'll just take one out so that you can have a look at that lovely sort of rough textured edge to the potato. Well, now they need to go into some really hot fat, so you have a roasting tin ready with some beef dripping in it, preheated at gas mark 7, and I'll get that out now. Now, in order to ensure that the fat is really hot when the potatoes go in, use a good solid roasting tin and then put it over direct heat so that when the potatoes hit the fat, it's really nice and hot. So there we are. Use a long handled spoon and then just put them in with the roasting tin over a gentle heat so that that's really hot when they go in. Then you just tip the fat to the corner of the pan and baste each potato so that it's covered, well covered with fat. And it doesn't have to be beef dripping. If you're serving them with beef, beef dripping is nice. If you're serving them with pork, lard is nice, or with lamb, lamb dripping, so that you keep your flavours. I don't think oil is a good medium to use for roast potatoes because it always has contrary flavours to the meat. So now they will go into a boiling hot oven, as I said before, number 7, and they'll put them on a high shelf, and they'll take about 40 minutes to get to the nice, crisp, crunchy stage. Well, that's good old roast potatoes for good old Sunday lunch. Now I want to show you a very special potato dish. I think one of the best potato dishes in the whole world. It's a bit extravagant, but it is rather lovely. It's called gratin dauphinoise, and you start off with a gratin dish, which is a shallow baking dish, and you have that very well buttered. Any sort of shallow baking dish will do, an earthenware one, anything you happen to have, and have it really well buttered. Just get rid of that lid. Now you need 1 pound of potatoes, and you need to have them thinly sliced. And I'd like to show you, while we're talking about thinly slicing potatoes, of course you can use a good sharp knife, but this instrument here is a mandolin. And this is quite a useful instrument. That blade there is for shredding, and then this one on the other side is for slicing. And so that you can take a potato and just slice it by just taking it down that blade really thinly in seconds. And then you get really nice thin slices of potato. I also find that that's very useful for slicing apples when you want thinly sliced apples in an apple flan. Well, now you've got your 1 pound of potatoes thinly sliced. The next thing you do is put them in a bowl of water and swirl them round and round and round to try and get some of the starch out. Drain them in a colander and then dry them in a cloth so that they're fairly dry. So here are my slices of potato. Now I'm going to put a layer in the base of the prepared dish. And you need to do several layers. You'll have time to be a bit more careful about it than I have. And season the layers as you go with a little bit of salt and a little bit of freshly milled pepper as the layers go in. And then the other thing that goes in is some garlic. Just a little bit of chopped garlic. And then another layer of potatoes, a bit more seasoning, a bit more garlic, and then you finish off with a layer of potatoes until the dish is full. And you've got to do it much more neatly than that. Now I'm going to show you what goes in to cook them in, and this is the, I'm afraid, the very extravagant part. I apologise, but they're cooked in a quarter of a pint of double cream and a quarter of a pint of milk. And I'm sorry if you're on a diet, but all I can say is it is really delicious, and you needn't have it every week, but just once in a while. So I'm going to mix the milk with the double cream, and I have been economical, you know, because really originally the recipe had all double cream in it, so I have tried to be a little bit economical. Now you pour that over the potatoes and pour it over as evenly as possible so that they're all nicely moistened. And then we're going to use another flavouring, favourite spice of mine, and that's freshly grated nutmeg. And you need about a quarter of a nutmeg, freshly grated. And I do keep on about freshly grated and freshly milled, I know, but it does make a difference. Now finally, it's going to have 1½ ounces of butter just put in flecks over the surface. 1½ ounces just flecked here and there, and that goes into a low oven. That would be gas mark 2 or the equivalent, and they'll take 1½ hours to cook. And that's a bit extravagant for just 1 pound of potatoes, so it's quite good to have them in the oven when you're cooking a casserole as well, so that you're using the oven wisely. Anyway, we've got some finished gratin dauphinoise now, so we'll get them out. You can sprinkle them with chopped parsley and take them to the table just like that. And I think they're very nice served with plain steaks or even the beurre en croûte that we made a little while ago. But I'll just take some out so that you can see how delicious they are. Lovely sliced potatoes, still retaining their shape, but with that lovely creamy nutmeggy sauce. Absolutely delicious. Well, now we're going to move on to another favourite vegetable of mine, and that's leeks. And as Bill said, they go on all through the winter, and you can leave them in the ground. But I think leeks are sometimes served wrongly. They're served whole, waterlogged, with nasty sort of pasty white sauce on them. And I think they deserve better than that. So I want to show you quickly how to do buttered leeks, which I think is the nicest way to cook them. But first of all, how to prepare a leek. And you cut off the root end and cut off most of the green, leaving about 1½ inches of green, and take off the tough outer skin. And then the way to clean them, they're always very dusty, having been earthed up in the ground to get blanched. So the best way to clean them is to slice the leek vertically like that, and then just fan it like this underneath cold running water, and you can see there's a little bit of dust in there. And if you do that under the cold running tap, you'll soon be able to clean all the dust out and get your leeks really clean. And then for this recipe, we're just going to cut them into squares like that. Now, the nice thing about this recipe is that we're not going to have, again, any water at all. All you do is you melt some butter for 1½ pounds of leeks, which is what I've got in my bowl here, ready prepared. For 1½ pounds of leeks, you need 1½ ounces of butter melted. And you put the melted butter in a pan, and then you pop the leeks in, just on their own, put a tight lid on and leave them under a low heat for about 10 to 15 minutes so that you can cook them like these I've got here. And this is just about right. I think what you need to have is still a little bit of bite left in them. I don't think they should be too soft and soggy. And I don't know whether you can actually see, but there is quite a lot of juice there of their own. They exude quite a lot of juice, so you can see they actually don't need any water at all. And that's a very simple way to prepare them and a very easy way of serving them, because you just sort of dollop them out on the plate and they're all very, very delicious. So that's a very quick, easy way, and one of my favourite ways to cook buttered leeks. Well, now we're going to move on in our campaign against water and cook a vegetable that's available not just in the winter, but all the year round. And because it's available all the year round, it's nice to find different things to do with it, and that's cauliflower. Now, this cauliflower is going to be cooked in a frying pan. And I started off in my frying pan here with a chopped onion, and that's been softened in a little bit of olive oil, or you can use groundnut oil or a mixture of groundnut oil and butter. Now I'm going to use a spice to flavour it with, and the spice I'm going to use is one that we've spoken about before, and that is coriander seeds. And I'm going to use a teaspoonful of coriander seeds, which I'm going to crush in my pestle and mortar. Now you just crush them fairly finely, and if you haven't got a pestle and mortar, don't worry, you can use the end of a rolling pin and an ordinary mixing bowl, and they'll crush up quite well in that. But that's the sort of texture you need. Then you put them in with the onion, because, as we've also mentioned before, it's heat that brings out the lovely aromatic flavours of spices. So as they begin to touch the heat, you get that lovely, beautiful coriander aroma. Now I've got, yet again, a clove of garlic, but you can leave this out and you can leave the coriander out if you want to. You can cook cauliflower like this just on its own if you want to. There are lots and lots of variations. Now, the cauliflower needs to be cut up into little florets, little pieces like this, about 1 inch in size. And just to make it a bit more colourful, I've also got some little pieces of broccoli head here to use as well, to mix them both. But you can make the recipe with either or together. So in goes the cauliflower and the broccoli, and it will shrink quite a bit whilst it's cooking. Now start off by just stirring the pieces of vegetable round to get them well coated with oil. And then, as soon as you've done that, you turn the heat down to fairly low and leave them to cook gently. And they'll take about 5 or 10 minutes to cook. Anyway, we'll leave those, move on to something else. I'll just turn the heat down, and we'll leave those to cook for a minute or two. And now I want to show you the final recipe. This one is for braised red cabbage with apples. And I think that red cabbage is a vegetable that deserves more than just being doused in malt vinegar. And in fact, cooked with apples, it's really lovely. Now you start off with a casserole and just pop the red cabbage in. Now I've got 3/4 pound of shredded red cabbage here. So that's going in. Any little escaped bits need to be reincorporated. Here I've got 1/2 pound of Bramley apples, which have been peeled and chopped. And here I've got 1/2 pound of onions, and they've been also peeled and chopped. And now I'm just going to give those a mixing round. In fact, it's always better to do this with your hands, to go in with your hands and just give it a good mixing before the rest of the flavourings go in. And before I put any more flavourings in there, I'm just going to nip back and have a look at that cauliflower, because whilst it's cooking, you just need to turn it around a little bit. Turn the pieces over. And don't worry if the onion becomes toasted, because the cauliflower will eventually. It gets a nice sort of crusty, toasted edge, which really does give it a lovely flavour too. Right, back to the red cabbage. And now I'm going to add 1½ tablespoons of soft brown sugar, and then 1½ tablespoons of wine vinegar, preferably wine vinegar. If you haven't got any wine vinegar, I'll give you a tip about using malt vinegar, which is so strong, it's lethal, and that is just dilute it 50% with water and then it won't be so strong. Now I've got, again, a clove of garlic, crushed, and now I'm going to put some spices in. First of all, some freshly grated nutmeg again, and about 1/4 of a nutmeg grated, and a little bit of cinnamon, about 1/8 of a teaspoon of cinnamon, ground cinnamon, and the same of ground cloves, but be careful with cloves because they're very strong, so don't be too heavy-handed with them. Now you preheat the oven for this, gas mark 2, or the equivalent temperatures, put a knob of butter in, then you put a tight-fitting lid on and let it cook very slowly for 3 hours. It does need 3 hours cooking to develop the flavour, and it really is a very delicious way of cooking cabbage, and it actually gets better too if you cook a whole lot. In fact, in the book there's double that quantity. You can go on heating it up day after day. I think it gets better as the days go on, the flavour. Right, we'll just go back to the cauliflower now, which in fact isn't quite ready. It needs to be toasted around the edges. The best way to tell if it's cooked really is to take a bit out and taste it. And it'll retain all its flavour because no water's been near it. It'll be really nice and have that little bit of bite and crunchiness to it. So we'll leave that to go on cooking for a minute or two more. And don't forget before you serve it to give it a good seasoning of salt and pepper. Now I'd like to just get some red cabbage out of the oven so you can see that finished off. The only way to shut the oven door when your hands are full. There we are then. That's the finished red cabbage, and I'll just try and show you the texture of it. You see it still retains its shape, and that's delicious with all pork dishes, nice with goulash, Lancashire hot pot. Well, that's all about vegetables. Bye-bye.